So, good morning, and welcome again to people joining us different parts of the world. I'd like to begin, I'd like to talk today about, or to go a little further into why we call this week a Holy Week, and what we mean by holiness, and why we think of this as a religious experience. And to lead us into the next round, I'd like to begin with this description of the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus went out with his disciples and crossed the Kedron ravine. There was a garden there, and he and his disciples went into it. The place was known to Judas, his betrayer, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas took a detachment of soldiers and police provided by the chief priests and the Pharisees, equipped with lanterns, torches and weapons, and made his way to the garden. Jesus, knowing all that was coming upon him, went out to them and asked, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. Jesus said, "I am he." And there stood Judas the traitor with him. When he said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again Jesus asked, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. Then Jesus said, "I have told you that I am he. If I am the man you want, let these others go." This was to make good his words, "I have not lost one of those whom you have given me." Thereupon Simon Peter drew the sword he was wearing and struck at the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus said to Peter, "Sheathe your sword. This is the cup my Father has given me. Shall I not drink it?" But it's a very dramatic moment. We'd make a great painting with the lanterns and the lights. And Jesus, in this version of the story, identifying himself. Judas doesn't have to identify him with the traitor's kiss. And identifying himself twice, because on the first occasion the soldiers are so struck by him that they fall to the ground, and he repeats his identification, and we can see here he's in complete control. He's master of the moment, and he tells the soldiers to let his companions go. I'm just looking for the other version of this if I can find it. Sorry, I'll find it later. This is from the Gospel of Matthew, just to give you a sense of how this story has been built up from different perspectives, and of course built up also with the interpretations that we have given it over the centuries. This is how Matthew describes it. This is after Judas kisses Jesus to identify him. They come forward, seize Jesus and hold him fast. So a different version. At that moment, one of those with Jesus, Peter is not named, at that moment, one of those with Jesus reached for his sword and drew it, and he struck at the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. But Jesus said to him, "Put up your sword. All who take the sword die by the sword. Do you not suppose that I cannot appeal to my Father, who would at once send to my aid more than 12 legions of angels? But then how could the scriptures be fulfilled, which say this must be?" Then all the disciples deserted him and ran away. So the basic theme and the basic meaning of the story is clearly the same, but the detail, each of those discrepancies or different points of view, each of them, I think, reveals something more, another layer of meaning. I mean, the interesting thing is that we have Peter, who's actually carrying a sword. I wouldn't have thought he'd been carrying a sword at all. And if he was carrying a weapon, you wouldn't have thought he would have used it. Clearly hadn't quite got Jesus' message yet. It's a perfectly natural response of Peter. Loved Jesus, saw him being arrested, in this version, Matthew's version, being held fast, being arrested and handcuffed or whatever, and then he rushes to his defense. But Jesus rejects any kind of violent intervention. So, I've only been to the Holy Land once, but we went to the Garden of Gethsemane as part of the pilgrimage, and it is a very powerful place, especially when the two things that struck me very strongly there, one was the flowers, little red poppy type flowers all over the garden, which I recognized from Galilee, from the hill of the Sermon on the Mount. So, which were probably the flowers that Jesus would have pointed to when he said, look at the lilies of the field, birds of the air, the lilies of the field. It's a beautiful pastoral scene there. So it makes you wonder whether that last night he wouldn't have been looking at these flowers in the Garden of Gethsemane and remembering the same flowers in his hometown or his home state of Galilee. And the other striking memory of detail there is a olive tree that's 2,500 years old. So it would have been there when Jesus was there, and he would have seen it. So those sort of details, plus the story that we know and has been part of our imagination, if we were told it at the beginning of our lives, this is what leads us to make pilgrimages to holy places. And we expect that we will get a religious experience of some kind in a holy place like that. And Jesus himself had set his face towards Jerusalem, we're told. The account of Jesus' life and his journey is cast as a journey to Jerusalem, the holy city of the Jews. And it was there that he had to go to complete his destiny. And that's where the prophets of his tradition, with whom he identified himself, this is where the prophets had to go to speak and to be killed. Jerusalem itself is a very strange holy city. Apparently every year a number of visitors or pilgrims had nervous breakdowns there and have to be taken away in custody by men in white coats. It's called the Jerusalem syndrome, and it's apparently they're overwhelmed by the psychic energy of the place. And it is a place of tremendous intensity, tremendous energy, which it is difficult to identify the source of, really. It certainly gives you a religious experience of some kind, but it's whether it's what we are comfortable to call holy is another matter. But clearly it is a holy place, invested with holiness by the people who go there and live there. But it's also a place of violence, place of bloodshed, place of hatred, place of conflict, just as it has always been. It's always been like that. Every Christmas and every Easter, in the Christian holy places, the holy sites of Jerusalem especially, there are fights among the Christians, physical fights. If you saw it on YouTube a couple of, at Christmas, the different Christian monks came out with their fists flaming at each other, because one of them had stepped over a boundary, and they are extraordinarily territorial and violently defend their territory. I think at Christmas they had to call in, well, not for the first time, the Israeli police to separate them. But then one group of monks got behind the police and started picking up chairs and throwing the chairs over the heads of the police in the church at the other heretics. So this is still going on, and quite often there's a fight in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and of course the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre are in the hands of, for many hundreds of years, of a Jew, particularly Jewish families, held, because the Orthodox, the Catholic, whoever else is there, all the different denominations, can't agree on who should have the key. So it's not, if this is a holy place, it's a funny kind of holy place. It's a place of bloodshed and violence. And it suggests that if it is in fact a holy place, then holiness is not what we think it is. Holiness doesn't live in the stones, or the physical fabric of the buildings, or even the ground soaked in blood. In all of these supposedly holy places, we find intense conflict and hatred and violence, and we often find, usually find, religious people who are living in the past, caught in the historical cycle of violence and perpetuating it. A false kind of religious experience. They're certainly very religious people, and they certainly experience their connection to that place and to their tradition in a very powerful way, so you could say that must be a religious experience. But I think we could also say, would have to say, that it's a false kind of religious experience, a false piety, a false kind of devotion. So it makes us think again about what holiness really means. If these are holy places, and I think they are, then they're not holy because anyone is perfect there. Holiness does not consist in human perfection. There's been a idea growing in Western thought, Western culture for a long time, that good religion, good morals, orthodox belief, and enforced religious observance produces a more stable and orderly society. We see this growing in Western society, maybe for a long time, but certainly say since the Reformation. It's the idea that religion is there to produce a good, stable order, and to bring people into a kind of a social discipline. So if people went to church more, then there would be less binge drinking. Big issue in English morality at the moment, or English moral thinking. How do we stop all the binge drinking that's going on? And immodesty. If children were given proper religious training, then they wouldn't be so sexually promiscuous, and we wouldn't have so much public immodesty or so on. So, and adolescents would be more polite on trains and buses. So the world would actually be a more respectable and proper place if religion was doing its job properly. And that identification of religion with good social order, I think, is really quite deeply embedded in many people's sense of what religion is, and even perhaps their sense of what holiness is. But if we actually look at the facts, if we look at the holy people we know, or the holy people in history, if we look at the scriptures, we see that holiness does not consist in being well behaved, in being polite and law-abiding and respectable. That isn't where holiness is found. But it's where we find holiness, where God's faithful and unswerving love is to be experienced even when we, human beings, are anything but loving and faithful. This is the peculiar and special nature of divine love. We are still learning how to love. And when human beings love, they, of course, expect to be loved in return, or like to be loved in return. And if they're not, then the human ego withdraws, reacts, takes umbrage, gets hurt, closes up. Very rarely does our capacity for love expand when we meet rejection. If it did, we would say that's an unusual person. So, normally speaking, when we love, we expect and demand, in a way, that it should be returned, and if it's not, we withdraw it. That's the human form of loving at this moment. Hopefully we will learn to love as God himself loves, as Jesus tells us, you must be whole, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, who loves like the sun that is equally beneficent to the good and the bad, the ungrateful and the wicked, and shines on good and bad alike. So the divine form of love, or maybe the divine love that we are growing into and trying to imitate, the divine love does not withdraw when it meets rejection. That's the difference. So holiness, we could say, becomes manifest when we are able to see that God has no pride, no ego. God does not withdraw where the divine love is rejected. Shakespeare has a sonnet that describes his love for the person he's writing to or about, that his love is an ever fixed mark. I forget now what it is. That alters not when it alteration finds. So it doesn't change when it meets a change in the person being loved. So Shakespeare is describing this in terms of a human love, but it's also equally a manifestation of divine love, as is Juliet's love, actually, in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet, much more than Romeo, has really understood what love really means. She expands with love, whereas he tends to become more fixated. So, this might give us a clue as to where holiness is found and what holiness really means. It manifests the nature of love itself, and it manifests the personal presence of God, who has no pride, or anything that we can call pride, and no ego. Or, I suppose you could argue that God has a massive ego, such a huge ego, the great I Am, that it could never feel insecure. It could never be rejected. It could never feel unwanted. It's just too massive. Well, the ego, by its nature, is mortal and insecure. But it would be one way of us trying to understand, in human terms, what the divine love might really be like. We can only glimpse it from its radiation rather than from a direct encounter. So holiness is something we feel. It's like an atmosphere, or it's an energy. People often say this. People often say in a house where there's meditation going on 3 or 4 times a day, they'll say, "Oh, there's a very nice energy in this house," and I think there is. Well, maybe holiness can be felt in the same way as an energy. But it's not invested, I think, so much in the stones or the bricks or the mortar or the physical ground, but it's experienced or felt from the ground of being, which is the divine love. And especially when it's felt in a place where people who are bad and unfaithful and egotistical and draw their sword against each other. It's in places like this that holiness really manifests itself and can be felt. Medjugorje, for many people, I've never been there, but for many people, many Catholics especially, but others too, it's a very holy place where Virgin Mary has made many apparitions. And still a very popular place of pilgrimage. But the history of the place is rather horrific. Religiously, the history is terrible. The Franciscans and the secular clergy have been fighting tooth and nail for ages. Really bitter conflict among the religious, these two religious groups there. And it has a historical, political history which is even more horrific. During the war, when a pro-fascist government was in place in that area, the ancient conflict between Catholic Croats and Orthodox Serbs erupted again, one of many times, and many horrible, appalling incidents where Serbian women and children were thrown off hilltops to their death by Catholic crowds, and Catholic clergy who were supporting the fascist regime, encouraged the villagers to burn or bury alive the children of Orthodox families. What a very nice place. Now, why should Our Lady choose to manifest there? I don't think there's any explanation for that. I'm not going to even try. Except Except it when I thought about that, I thought of another place in Scotland, in Dunblane, where maybe 20 years ago now, I think, a terrible incident occurred one morning. A crazed man walked into a primary school and shot many children and some of the teachers. And I was there a couple of years later giving some talks, and I went up to the graveyard, of course, and it was not what I expected, and the atmosphere and the people were not what I expected. There was a piece there which didn't seem to fit the story or the memory at all, and had the same experience in Auschwitz a couple of occasions. I was walking around Auschwitz the first time, and I a bit stunned by being there and what I was hearing, and I suddenly, I wasn't thinking anything, but just a bit overwhelmed by feeling. And then I heard my mind saying, "I don't believe it, I don't believe it." And what was almost as difficult to believe was, again, this feeling, this atmosphere of peace. Now, I think we have to be very careful about saying that those are holy places, because I don't think we have the right to say it is a holy place. It's only the people who have suffered there who could have that right. Although we know that some people, like Etty Hillesum, found God's holy ground of being in that place and in that experience. But not all did. So, and we don't have the right to preach to people who have been through that total suffering of their cross, and we don't have the right to tell them that they should forgive. Nevertheless, we can say perhaps that Gethsemane or Calvary are holy places. And the reason we can perhaps say that is because the crime that was committed there, the inhumanity, was consciously accepted by the victim. And not just consciously accepted, but owned by the victim, by Jesus. And we see that in Jesus' response, or the dramatic response, but in the account of his arrest and then of his way of responding to his trial. Perhaps the only way we can take the sting out of an evil action is not to resist it, and to accept it as if it were our own. That seems to be the deep dynamic of Jesus' passion, his suffering, and his death. It isn't that he was, paying off an old debt to God the Father. That's a very crass image, really, or elementary image, to try to describe the redemptive suffering of the story. But it seems as if Jesus consciously and willingly accepted what was being imposed on him, the way he was being treated, as an innocent victim, and we see him as an innocent victim. We see it from the inside. We don't see it from the outside. We see it from the point of view, of his point of view. So we know he's innocent. There's no justification for treating him like this at all. And yet what we also see is something that absolutely staggers the mind, which is the ability not to resist. I mean, not just because he was passive, but actively not to resist. It's easy to be passive if you're a victim, maybe even a way of defending yourself. But he wasn't passive, he was actively non-resistant, or actively non-violent, we would say. And we see that clearly in the way he rebuked Peter from taking up the sword. So a holy place is perhaps a place where where the divine nature of love has been the response, or has been manifested towards an expression of human evil or inhumanity. And this is what we call forgiveness at work. When forgiveness pours out towards the criminal, simultaneously with the criminal's action. So it's not like I'm going to get my own back on you, and if I'm in a good mood I might let you off later when I bring you to justice. But it's simultaneously the criminal is accepted and owned and forgiven as he is at that moment, at that worst of moments. Even as he identifies himself with the evil he is committing. Father, forgive them because they do not know what they are doing. So if this is what holiness means, it's not at all about being respectable or well-behaved. And because we identify, particularly in the institutional church, we identify holiness with the saints, and the saints are those who have been through a process of sanitization. Their lives have been airbrushed. And that's often, sometimes why it takes a long time to get them canonized. Everybody, it's better to forget their imperfections and rewrite them. But it's always more. It's like when Mother Teresa's diaries, were discovered, and we realized that she wasn't living in this blissful experience of the presence of God all her life, doing good, but she was suffering an intense inner desert and a feeling of God's absence and a feeling of a lack of affective, emotional consolation or affirmation. And some people say, oh, she wasn't such a saint after all, she was just like the rest of us. And what was her motivation for doing all this good work when she was feeling like this anyway, psychologizing where she was coming from. But for other people, this made her much more human and particular and singular, which is what holy people usually are, rather unusual. So anyway, the lives of those we canonize usually have to be rewritten to avoid embarrassing those people who, sometimes for their own political purposes, want them to be called holy. But that isn't what holiness means, at least not as we experience it. It's a much more troubling thing, holiness. It's one that is not just about human perfection. It's not at all about human perfection. In fact, it's about the divine love being experienced in the midst of human sinfulness. So if religious experience is authentic, then it is an encounter with holiness of this kind. Not in the sanitized, cinematic kind of holiness that we like to package it in, which is kind of a world in which there is good order and respectability and people behave well, but with a holiness that is God's presence seen and experienced where it should not be, where we feel it has no right to be or doesn't fit. And if you saw the film In Bruges, did any of you see that? I think that is a very good film describing holiness. It's a funny film, but it's rather dark, black humour. It's about two hitmen, professional assassins, who one of whom kills a child accidentally in the course of his work, and their boss sends them both off to Bruges to lay low and keep out of the public eye. But in fact, the boss, who is a cruel and ruthless criminal and killer himself, operates by certain principles, and one of them is, if you kill a child, then you should be killed, or you should kill yourself, he says. So he sends them off to Bruges, and then he sends instructions to one of the killers to kill the other one, the one who killed the child. And so this is a professional job, he says, he says to himself, well, I like this young guy, but this is my job, so sorry about that. But there is already the beginning of a friendship and a connection. And the young guy who had killed the child was in anguish about what he'd done, and he decided to shoot himself. So he was sitting in a park with his back to his friend, who was coming forward to shoot him. And as his friend came forward with his gun, ready to shoot him in the back of the head, the young guy takes out his gun to shoot himself like this. At which his friend says, "Don't do it." And stops him from killing himself. And then the other one noticed, he said, "You're carrying a gun." He said, "You were going to kill me." He said, "Yes, I'm sorry, but..." So then his friend decides not to fulfill the contract, but to get the young guy out of town, because he says, you did a terrible thing, but you can live again. You can change. So he puts him on a train and sends him away somewhere. But the boss arrives, intending to finish the job himself, because he realizes this guy isn't going to do it. So then there's a complicated and funny series of scenes in which, at the end, the young guy's friend throws himself off the top of a tower in order to warn the young guy that the boss is there about to kill him. So he sacrifices himself for his friend. And then the boss starts to chase the young guy around, trying to shoot him. And eventually he does shoot him. But in shooting him, he shoots a midget. Dwarf. And the midget has been a funny character in the film up to this point. And he's shot, but he's dressed as a child. And the boss thinks he's shot a child. And the young guy, who is dying on the ground, sees the boss about to shoot himself, because he says, we've got to live by our principles. If you kill a child, you must shoot yourself. So But the young killer, who is now dying, is trying to tell him it's not a child, it's a midget. But he doesn't get the message across, so the boss shoots himself. So everyone's dead. So all of these terrible people have all ended in a bloodbath. And Bruges, which is a very lovely, peaceful town, as the Belgians here will know, is rather shocked by all the shooting and violence, and the good order of the town has been disrupted by these terrible, bad criminals. But who's holy? Where's the holiness there? I mean, you certainly have some very bad behavior, but you have also seen self-sacrifice, and you've also seen a forgiveness that is instinctive and complete. So, a better representation of holiness than Bernadette of Lourdes, if you remember that film, whenever it was, the 1960s. You know. So, holiness arises then from a very messy place in human experience. It rises from the bloody and the desecrated ground of human sinfulness, as it does in our own lives as well, not only in the great historical places like Israel, but in our own personal lives. It doesn't arise from our being well-behaved and good. We may be good or better because we have experienced holiness. But we are not holy because we have acted well. Only God is holy. Only God is good. But we are sanctified. We are redeemed. We are made good in every sense of that phrase. We are made good by in contact with, encountering that love of God. So, just before we move for our... Do we have our break now, or do we have meditation now? Yeah. We have a little coffee break now. Maybe we can play out with some music as we say goodbye to our friends from around the world. I was looking at the list of the countries who've been sharing these times with us, and it's wonderful to feel connected to so many of you. And we hope, all of us here, hope that you feel connected with us on this beautiful island. So as before we go offline, we'll maybe play a little music. Vincent and Jonathan will play us out.